Siete which is the installment that would be available for your viewing at break time via Jill McTavish, called Communities of Practice. And that's available for you over there during the break for you to browse, and you'll be available for discussion. Great, thank you very much. And I would like to now acknowledge the venue by recognizing Joan Johnson, Deputy Library Director in charge of the Milwaukee Public Libraries, and to thank them for this wonderful space.
Thank you. I'd just like to say good morning to everyone and a belated welcome to the Central Library's Centennial Hall and the Loose Room, where we are sitting now. We are very happy to be one of the hosts for the second Milwaukee Conference on the Ethics of Information Organization. And I would like to congratulate the chair, Hope Olson, and the entire program committee on attracting such a wonderful list of scholars and speakers who you'll have the pleasure of hearing and conversing with over the next couple of days. It sounds like a great conference, and it sounds like you're already off to a really great start this morning. If you have a chance to, like if you have a little extra time on the lunch break or at the end of the day today, I really do hope that you'll have, that you'll take a moment to explore some of the other areas of the building and take a look at some of the collections and displays and exhibits that are up throughout the building. And if you get a chance, feel free to talk with staff. If you stop into the humanities and archives, the research room, that might be a great place to stop in and say hello and talk with some of the staff there, who I'm sure many share a lot of the concerns around the issues that you're discussing over the next couple of days. I also would like to invite you back, if you are able to, in the future, to come and take a tour with us. We have docents who do tours on Saturday afternoons of the Central Library architectural tours, and then we also do green roof tours 3 times a week, Mondays and Wednesdays in the afternoon, and then on Saturday mornings. So I would love to have you all come back for that. And those of you who are here from Madison, or if you know the Wisconsin Historical Society, this building should feel very familiar because we share the same architects, Ferry and Kloss, who we opened our building in 1898, and the commission for the Wisconsin Historical Society was started in the 1900s. It was a couple years later. So there are a lot of similarities if you know that space. So again, I just want to thank you for a few minutes to welcome you, and we're so happy you thought of us to be a venue. We're always happy to support the university. So have a great conference.
Thank you very much. But it's over. Now we get to start work again. Right, Yenzer? Excellent. So we have 2 papers in the next session, which will take us all the way from the morning session up to lunch. We have Tina Gross, who will be presenting, and Danielle Martinez Avila, who will be presenting a paper with co-authored with Margaret Kipp and Hope Olson. Tina Gross is a catalog librarian, and as of July 1st, she will be an associate professor at St. Cloud State University, volunteer indexer for the Hispanic American Periodicals Index, contributor to the book Radical Cataloging, resident of the Minnesota District represented by Michelle Bachman, and a member of Occupy St. Cloud. So there's a balance there, I think, right? Daniel Martinez Avila is a doctoral student in Library and Information Science at the Universidad Carlos III de Madrid. He's visited the School of Information Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in 2009, 10, and 2012, sponsored by the FPU program of the Spanish Ministry of Education and the Universidad Carlos III de Madrid. Before pursuing his PhD, he had worked for 4 years in a school library and for 3 years in one of the main bookstores in Madrid. A lover of books and information, obviously. Margaret Kipp is an assistant professor at UW-Milwaukee School of Information Studies and is a member of the Information Organization Research Group. Her research interests are in social tagging, Web 2.0, and Library 2.0, metadata information organization, applied informatics databases, and information retrieval. And by the way, her Google Scholar profile is one of the most impressive of a junior researcher in KO that I have ever seen, so it's very cool to look at, so check it out. Hope Olson is a professor in the School of Information Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She's an affiliate with the Center of Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She's well known for her book, The Power to Name, Locating Limits of Subject Representation in Libraries. Her current publications span diversity education in LIS, epistemic presumptions of authorship, and she continues to reveal that our assumptions about classification in our contemporary society are infused with an unreflective bias. So Tina will talk today, there you go. Tina will talk today about Eliminate, Abandon, and Dismantle, Cataloging in Library Consultant Reports. And Daniel will talk about, where is it? There it is. The DDC and BISAC? Yeah? BISAC. The changing balance between corporations and public institutions. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm a bit of a PowerPoint minimalist, as you will probably see. I think it's some feeble form of resistance. But anyway, so the initial idea for this was to talk about a number of different consultant reports. I was going to start with the Calhoun report, done for the Library of Congress a few years ago that sort of had a big impact, and then talk about a couple of OCLC reports and conclude with a more recent one. But I decided actually to focus on one in particular just because it's having such a tremendous impact this year. So before I get into it, I just want to say I tend to use the term cataloging throughout the presentation, and when I say that, I'm not referring necessarily just to traditional cataloging, but to all sort of metadata activities in academic libraries. So I just wanted to clarify that. Okay, so this is the report that I'm going to talk about. Redefining the academic library, and it's actually not by a library consulting firm. It was done by the University Leadership Council, which is a subgroup of the Education Advisory Board, which is a subgroup of the Advisory Board Company, which is an enormous for-profit consulting firm. And they do their primary business for the healthcare industry, so they do custom research for pharmaceutical and insurance companies and hospitals, things like that. Their NASDAQ symbol is ABCO. So this report was released to the members of the University Leadership Council in 2011 and was released to the general public in the beginning of 2012. And since then, it's sort of taken at least the academic library world by storm. It's been described all over the place as seminal, as a landmark report. And if you work in an academic library, there is a very high probability that you have seen this report, that it's been the focus of discussions, of visioning discussions in your institution. And I just want to ask, if you could raise your hand if you've encountered this report or seen it or read it or been, okay. Okay, so in preparing, one of the things that I tried to look into is that it's been greeted with pretty much an overwhelmingly positive sort of odd response. And I was looking to see if there's been any kind of critical or analytical response at all, and I was really only able to find two things. And one is from Jill Emery, who is a librarian in Portland and the Charleston Advisor, and I'm going to actually quote from that a little later. And the other was Barbara Pfister wrote a blog post about it, and she's not particularly critical of the content, but essentially what she says is, this isn't that fantastically groundbreaking, this is all stuff that we've heard before and that everyone is already dealing with. And she makes the argument that the report sort of positions the academic library world is on this big divide between the print past and the digital future, and she says that that's really a very kind of passé, the past argument that everyone is well beyond, and that the real debate now is between open access and sharing and closed for-profit proprietary stuff. So she's quibbling a little bit with the focus, but really those were the only two things at least in print, that I was able to find anyone not being sort of completely gaga in their response to the report. And much of what it says is pretty benign and broadly accepted. There's a discussion of copyright in ebooks that is a good summary of the state of things and pretty informative, and the report comes down pretty solidly on the side of open access. So I would not want to argue that it's an abomination from beginning to end, but it is really terrible for some areas of librarianship, especially cataloging, and it makes very sweeping recommendations that if it were embraced completely by the provosts to whom it is addressed, it could mean the demise not just of cataloging in academic libraries, but also of collection building, of reference service that is provided by librarians based at one's own university, and a number of different things. And so I found my personal experience in talking to people about it, and this has happened to me repeatedly, is that someone that I know, not necessarily a cataloger, but a librarian, will mention that this report has come up at their institution, that we're having some kind of sessions organized around it, and just kind of timidly not really revealing much about what they think about it. And I will respond by saying, oh, I'm giving this presentation coming up pretty soon where I'm actually kind of picking it apart and criticizing it. And then that sort of seems to give the other person permission to be, oh my God, I can't believe how horrible this thing is, and how our provosts are all just going to listen to this and cram all this stuff through. And it made me try to process exactly what's behind that, like why there's been so little critical response when clearly there are a lot of people out there who disagree strongly with at least aspects of it. And is it just that we're so flummoxed by the incredible slickness of it, because it is very slick? Are we too afraid for our jobs to speak up, that the budget crisis has made people feel that they really need to hunker down and not raise any criticisms? And I'm not really sure what the reason is. But all of that sort of inspired me to take this approach for this presentation, which is to propose a series of questions that catalogers in particular should try to answer for themselves and for their administrators when they're asked to respond to a consultant report of this nature, to help make some of the assumptions that are being made explicit and to grapple with the implications. And so some of the questions are very specific to cataloging. A few of them are broader, and I would argue that all of them have ethical implications for the profession. Okay, so to start, very simple and obvious. What does the report actually say about the future of cataloging and what innovation and changes are taking place or ought to be taking place? And in most cases, you might expect that linked data would be talked about, maybe the extensible catalog, or at a minimum, RDA and Ferber, or replacing MARC with something else, or even some kind of discussion about how cataloging efforts need to focus more on creating metadata for locally produced content. Any of these kind of discussions would be a reasonable starting place that you would expect something engaged in the profession to have something to say about. In this case, this particular report, there's really just one paragraph that talks about the future of cataloging, and this is the heading. Cataloging is no longer a local activity. And so in short, from this report's perspective, the only innovation or advance that needs to happen in cataloging is to stop doing it. Okay, what role does this report maintain or assume that libraries should have in producing the metadata that they use? Now, for me, a core principle of being a cataloging practitioner is that libraries and the librarians who work at them have some kind of a collective responsibility to produce this body of metadata that we share, and that we all benefit from that in return, and that the way that that happens in the future we can expect to change, but at least I do expect it to continue to happen. So this is the body of that paragraph that begins cataloging no longer a local activity, and I'm not sure how well you can read it, so I'm just going to read it out. It says, as one contact put it, we don't need 1,000 different descriptions of the same book. the ability to standardize and share basic catalog entries for almost all holdings eliminates much of the need for dedicated catalogers in academic libraries. Books can now be purchased shelf-ready from vendors, arriving fully processed and ready to lend to patrons. So it's interesting, when they say 1,000 different descriptions, are they referring to copy cataloging with sort of time-consuming local modifications? Do they actually think that every library creates its own description of every resource? Do they think that the ability to standardize and share basic catalog entries is a recent development? Or that it has no connection to the existence of dedicated catalogers in libraries? Do they think that vendor prices will stay the same if they have to create all of those records themselves? There's a whole lot wrong with this statement. I could probably spend the whole rest of the presentation unpacking it, but I think just to go back to the question, the report urges the library community to approach cataloging as something that we pay others to do and not something that we do ourselves. Okay, how does this report address the impact of the quality of cataloging and metadata on users? Now, interestingly, given what I've showed you about this report so far, you might expect that it doesn't have anything to say about that either. Amazingly, there is this little section that I've highlighted in green where they're talking about the espresso book machine. So interestingly, they kind of pan this particular type of print on demand. And I think, probably all of us remember 5-6 years ago when the espresso book machine was viewed as sort of, the future, and that every library was going to have one within 6 months and whatever. So they actually, talking about why the espresso book machine is limited in practice, they mention a report from a user where he details how the poor metadata in the existing catalog for the book machine makes discovery difficult. Now, so it's fascinating that they can acknowledge that this is actually possible, but at the same time, there's no recognition whatever that this could ever be an issue with metadata that comes from vendors. Okay. Does the report make apocalyptic predictions about the future of libraries? So this is where I'm going to quote Jill Emery. So when her criticism of the report is she talks about it collectively with a bunch of other writings about the future of libraries, and is sort of making a criticism of what she calls the fear and self-loathing in library land. And here's a quote from her. "The library pundits are saying, be afraid. Be very afraid for your job. The future of librarianship is in peril, and hope is futile, and librarians are not doing enough to maintain our professional relevance in the 21st century. These pundits speak loudly and carry catchphrases that get picked up on all our news channels and repeated over and over and over again. It started with the Title Forum in 2009 and has picked up momentum over the past 3 years, with the latest provocative statements reading like death knells." So the reason that I think that this is an important question to ask is sort of separate from the question of whether do libraries really face an existential crisis, because I think that's something that reasonable people can discuss, and it's certainly a possible thing that could happen. But I think that couching discussions about the future of libraries with that as a starting point is just a fantastically disingenuous and manipulative way to begin a discussion. And of course, this report takes the apocalyptic talk really literally and names what it considers the 4 horsemen of the library apocalypse. And then, of course, quotes the Title Forum as sort of representing the views of librarians in general, library professionals themselves, So, and partly this is just a pet peeve of mine because we see it again and again, this sort of faux bold, telling it like it is, that I think sometimes it's meant to be so provocative that it will shake traditionalist librarians out of their slumber, like that type of thing. But again, I think it's really a fear-mongering tactic that is not meant to be the basis of a genuine exploratory discussion, but it's usually paired with a particular prescription that does not necessarily derive naturally from this fear, but is used as a way to sort of add force behind it. And I just think whenever we see this kind of talk, we need to immediately be like, okay, what are these people up to in trying to present it this way? Because it's just very problematic. Okay, does this report make generalizations based on when users start their research? This is another thing that I included largely because it's a pet peeve of mine, and just because I've seen it, it's so ubiquitous, and it's in the Calhoun report, which I mentioned earlier, that people make assertions about the irrelevance of libraries and how no one uses them in their searches, yada, 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 based on data that is specifically about where users start their research. So this is okay, so both of these tables are about where students and users start their research, and yet this is characterized as faculty and students already looking elsewhere for search help. So I'm not sure that starting a search and looking for search help, or any other kind of additional steps of the research process, that I'm a cataloger and I may start my research process on a search engine. That certainly doesn't mean that I don't use library resources. And which isn't to say that I would dispute that overall usage is declining, or that any of that, that those aren't things that need to be discussed and addressed. But this substitution of starting research with doing research at all, or any parts of the research process, what is behind the active seeking to exaggerate this, or to overstating? Why is overstating this problem preferable to an honest assessment? So I really think, again, this is another one of these tactics that we just, to be very frank, that we need to be prepared to call bullshit when we see this type of substitution happening. Okay, does this report present the discontinuing of activities or cutting of services as innovation? So, given the pressures that everyone are under, it may be the case that sometimes the cutting of services and discontinuing of activities is unavoidable, but it's a little alarming to see it presented as something to aspire to and laud in and of itself. So this is one of the things that the report does is it uses the University of California at Merced, which is a relatively new research institution. It just started up a few years ago, as sort of the model of what an academic librarian today ought to aspire to be. And if you look at this sort of overview, most of the things that they are referencing here are things that they don't do, not new innovative practices, but things that they've outsourced, things that are not a concern anymore. And so, okay. So if we're trying to have a serious discussion about what the future is and what we ought to do, if that's limited to discontinuing things and not any kind of creativity or imagination or innovation, obviously that's a huge problem. Okay, and related to that, does the report propose a model that's sustainable if it's adopted by all or most libraries? So this is another paragraph from, I'm talking about UC Merced, and I just want to point out a few things, because there's a weird kind of contrast. So one of the reasons that this new university library is able to get by with a very, very minimal collection is because they're part of the UC system, which is well established and has many very large research libraries. So they point that out here, that they have access to millions of volumes held at the other UC institutions, so there's not as much need for them to maintain a research collection locally. There are no subject specialists or catalogers on staff. And the reference services are fully outsourced to virtual providers. And then we have all of this sort of marshaled at the bottom, that this model is proof that such a future is indeed viable even at research institutions, even though all of the stuff coming before are examples of how this university is able to use the work and resources of other research libraries that have not followed this model, and that is, in fact, if every university library in the UC system were like this, it would be completely ridiculous. That they wouldn't have that to fall back on. So advocating a parasitical model, I think, is an issue. Okay, so this is the final one. Does this report present austerity as immutable? And what I mean by that is that sort of painting a picture where budget cuts and lack of resources and more austerity with just no end in sight are assumed without question. Not only that, but taking austerity for granted and accommodating to it eagerly is presented as in itself innovative and progressive and bold. And there's no hint of resistance to austerity or of even questioning it. It's happening, and this report tells us that the only way for libraries to survive is to learn to live on whatever budgets are handed down, and the reasons for which austerity is being imposed are assumed to be legitimate and indisputable. So there's no recognition that resources are being systematically drained, not just from libraries and universities, but from the meeting of all social needs and the public good in general. I think my Occupy side is coming out now. Or that this reallocation of resources is often justified by crises, real or imagined. So you could look at Social Security, public schools and universities, post office, etc. So there are many reasons for which this, what I would argue is a transfer of wealth, is happening, but an actual lack of resources is not one of them. So I'm not suggesting that I think a consultant's report about libraries is ever going to say these budget cuts are class warfare and we have to fight back, though that is my personal opinion, obviously. But when they are helping to reinforce the new normal of getting used to and accepting austerity, that's something that we need to recognize and to see for what it is.